So I know it's been a little while since I made one of these videos, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to look at and prepare for our discussion and our investigation on cellular respiration, which I've already told you is one of the most complex processes that you need to know in our year's worth of curriculum. So cellular respiration is pretty complex. There are a lot of moving pieces. And you need to be aware of all those moving pieces just as you were with photosynthesis. And remember, it took a little while for us to get photosynthesis down. I expect you to be able to pick this up a little bit more quickly now that we are a quarter into the year, a quarter plus a few weeks. So I think that you have a better handle on how the class works and what you need to do to be best prepared. You have to watch this video to be prepared for the more in-depth discussion of what's going on in cell respiration in our following class on Wednesday, okay? So, cell respiration starts on page 122, but there's an additional higher level option. I'm just going to go over the overview here that starts on page 122 of your book. You also should have received a handout from me in class that with some guided notes, but I want these notes to be separate. And then I want you to transfer some of this information onto the other notes handout that you got. So these notes should be still be hand-drawn. You should write what I write and add whatever notes that I discuss to your notes. And then you transfer that information over to answer the questions that are on that handout. Okay? So we're starting on 2.8 here. And there's some basic understandings that may be new to you, but I want to warn you that these are going to be concepts and axioms that you need to have in your mind as we continue to talk about cell respiration in more detail. So first thing is you need to be able to define this term, right? So you need to be able to define cell respiration as the controlled, we're going to annotate this in a second, the controlled release of energy from organic molecules to produce ATP. Alright, so you need to remember that ATP, you need to know what ATP stands for. So remember that the whole point of this process is to make ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. Alright, so that's ATP. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And this is the part that sometimes can change, which we'll talk a little about, to di and mono. So it would be ADP or AMP. But it relates to, it refers to the number of phosphate groups, which we'll talk about what that means in a second, why that matters. The other term that you need to make sure you understand is the controlled release. The reason that that's stated that way is that it's enzymatically controlled. Alright? So perhaps we need to think a little bit about enzymes before we jump too far into this process, into too much detail. But it's the release of energy from organic molecules, another term. So remember that molecules are collections of atoms, right? They're bonded together, often covalently bonded, and organic is referring to carbon containing. So those molecules that you should be thinking about are carbohydrates. These are macromolecules. We've talked about these before. We're about to dive into this a little bit more. Carbohydrates, lipids, and protein. Alright, so this is about releasing energy from these molecules and harnessing them to make ATP. And ATP is a usable form of energy that your cells and all living things need and depend on. And I'm going to tell you that these two are often what you think about as sources of energy, carbohydrates being most the quickest energy to obtain, the quickest to run through cellular respiration. And proteins can be as well. So when you don't have carbs or lipids, your body will start to break down proteins to release the energy to make ATP to keep you alive. Okay? But you need to know it more than just sugar breaking down to ATP, right? So it's about these organic molecules. You need to commit this definition to memory and make sure that you can break that down. Now, where is that energy stored in those organic molecules? So here's this word energy, right? So where is it stored? So it's stored in the covalent bonds in the molecule. So the more covalent bonds there are, perhaps there is more energy. And lipids provide a lot of energy for us. It stores energy in high concentration because they're so long. And so if you don't know what this molecular structure is of, let's say, a fatty acid, you might want to just Google that. Pause and Google, and you'll see how long those chains can be. All right, so to make ATP, we need to think a little bit more about this as well. So there's a little diagram in the book, but I'm gonna redraw it here because I think it's important to make sure that you understand. Because ATP is not really made out of scratch, as nothing is, right? So ADP, adenosine diphosphate plus a phosphate. We've seen this in photosynthesis. And a lone phosphate, an inorganic phosphate because it's not bonded to any kind of carbon, through cell respiration, get converted into ATP. And then what happens is that through the use of that ATP, the book calls this active cell processes. We'll talk about what some of these things are in a minute. That ATP gets broken back down into ADP and phosphate. And so it's through this process that the energy from these molecules are used to combine this third phosphate onto ADP to make ATP, which is then used by the different parts of your cell. The other thing that you should make sure that you understand is that these carbs, lipids, and proteins are made from plants, right, up a food web. And the nitrates that are used in the proteins for the nitrogenous atoms, or the nitrogen atoms, are synthesized by the plants into these amino acids, which then are made by the proteins in the plant cells, ribosomes. The lipids and the carbs are produced through photosynthesis, mostly through the carbon dioxide that's being absorbed through the stomata on the leaves, and then the hydrogens are contributed by or from the water molecules that were absorbed through the roots and then moved up the plant, often depending on what kind of plant we're talking about, but moves up the stem to the leaves, right? So it's quite a complicated process. The other thing to think about, I'm going to put a little note here, is that the ATP here that's produced through cell respiration, this same ATP here, does not leave a cell. Does not leave a cell. Which means that all cells must make their own ATP, which means they need their own enzymes, their own reactants to make that ATP, right? So, and once ATP is made, it's a ready source of energy for all cells, right? So, let's talk about some of these active cell processes, so that you know what really we're talking about here. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. Use a different color. So some of these active cell processes. The book outlines this as 3. When I was in school, we learned it as 5. But these are the 3 main types of activity. And you need to know this list. If I were to ask you, what are the 3 main types of activity that require ATP? You would be able to list these. So synthesize means to make, right? If I asked you to synthesize something, you'd be making something. Synthesizing large molecules or macromolecules, like DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA, ribonucleic acid, and proteins. All right, so I'm just going to give you a little teaser here. So DNA, we're making more DNA. That's called DNA replication. DNA replication. So making more DNA is DNA replication. Going from DNA to RNA is transcription. And RNA to proteins is translation. And remember that these proteins are made at the ribosomes. All right? So we're going to dive into that, but all of that later, but all of that requires ATP. And I hope that you ask me where that ATP is used later, because often when we talk about DNA to RNA and proteins, we skip over the ATP part, assuming that you know that ATP is required. But you might want to know exactly where when we get there. Also, it's involved in pumping ions or molecules across all kinds of membranes, not just plasma membranes, across membranes via active transport. All right, so in order to pump something, and this is a type of transport across a membrane, remember that, if you remember this maybe, this is when something goes from low concentration to high concentration. In other words, where there's not a lot of something, it's getting pumped to where there's a lot of something. That takes energy to go against the gradient, the normal flow of things spreading out, and that requires ATP. The third is moving things around inside the cell. So moving things around inside the cell. Let me make that inside the cell. So remember that chromosomes, remember this I hope from mitosis and meiosis, chromosomes are moved by filaments, right? Microtubules. We've got vesicles that move. So there are little motor proteins that pull them across on the microtubules, or even protein fibers that interlock. Protein fibers within cells that interlock, causing contraction. Oops. Causing, I was trying to blend those two words. Causing contraction. It's contracting the two words. Okay. And so that's key, right? That you need to know that. But when we go into this respiration, there's a key concept that I need you to make sure that you understand. And I'm going to kind of break this down into kind of a flow chart. The book does not do. So we're talking about cell respiration, or cellular, I'm going to spell it all out. Cellular respiration. There are several different kinds, right? So there's two major categories, right, that we're going to call, sorry, I'm moving my screen around here. Cellular respiration. So there's anaerobic, and aerobic. Right, so aerobic means with oxygen gas, or O2, and anaerobic is without oxygen gas, right? So these are the two main types, and there's a kind of a fine distinction between what's going on here, because anaerobic respiration technically is happening as the first part of cellular respiration all the time. The aerobic part is the part that you need to kind of like spend some time thinking about, because aerobic cell respiration is the part that happens in the mitochondria. That's the aerobic cell respiration. Whereas the anaerobic cell respiration happens in cytoplasm. And remember that not all kinds of cells have mitochondria. Prokaryotes do not have mitochondria, but all types of cells have cytoplasm. So all types of cells are able to do anaerobic respiration. And the key here is that it's gives off a small yield of ATP, whereas aerobic respiration gives off a high yield or a large yield of ATP. So aerobic cell respiration makes lots and lots of ATP. And so if you remember that, I'm going to add a little note up here, that cell respiration, you might remember this equation as something, I'm going to write it in word format first. Glucose plus oxygen gas give off CO2, water, and ATP, which is actually almost the exact opposite of the cell respiration. The photosynthesis reaction, except that there was light energy over the arrow. Flip this arrow around, ATP gets turned into light energy. So you should understand how photosynthesis and cell respiration work together as a cyclical process that, when thought of as a complete unit, because plants can do all of it, the light energy gets converted into this molecular ATP energy, which is the usable form for all living things. And if I confused you, you need to ask me a question about that. As part of at the beginning of the next class. But hopefully you can figure that out, of what I just went through really quickly. So when we're talking about anaerobic respiration, what we're really talking about is when there's no oxygen, right? So it's just glucose getting broken down into these processes. But oxygen is a key reactant to allow for aerobic respiration to give off lots and lots of ATP. So anaerobic respiration is really when that glucose is broken down, but this is really useful in just several situations, right? So let me just kind of clarify a little bit. So sometimes this can be thought of as part 1, and then this part in aerobic respirations has parts 2 and 3 that we're going to learn a little bit more about. So the functions of this, or the uses, when it's really useful, is like when a short burst of energy is needed. A short burst of, I'm just going to abbreviate energy, is needed. So you don't need a lot of it, so it can go really quickly. You only have to go through one process, not 3, to make this an ATP. And we're talking about energy, we're talking about ATP. You need to tell me ATP every time. Let's say when oxygen is low, like there's not a lot of oxygen left in the cells, or when the environment is low in oxygen, right? So when there's not a lot of oxygen left, there's not a lot to work with. And so you need to make sure that you understand that there are 2 types of anaerobic respiration, and especially when it's not leading into the aerobic respiration, right? So when it does not go over that way, there are 2 things that you need to make sure you understand. So in animals, which include us, in animals, we have something called lactic acid. You might have learned this in 9th grade, I hope you did. Lactic acid fermentation. Which really, so both of these are types of fermentation. These arrows both represent types of fermentation in animals. that lactic acid fermentation basically follows this kind of format. So this glucose molecule, which happens to be a 6-carbon molecule, right? C6H12O6, gets broken down, and the molecular bonds are broken. So some of that can be taken to add the adenosine diphosphate and phosphate to make ATP. And it produces this molecule called lactic acid, or sometimes referred to as lactate. Right? So lactate, the noun, not the verb. And then this lactate, it actually makes 2 of them, right? So 2 of them, which each of them are a 3-carbon molecule. So conveniently, when there is oxygen present, right? So when oxygen's low in cells or in the environment, this is what happens. But when then you get oxygen reintroduced, then this process can be reversed. Of course, it takes ATP to do that, to reconvert it, but then that glucose then can go through the aerobic components to make off lots and lots of ATP, right? So that's really good. And that's us, right? So you actually might feel this lactate build up. If you are working out so hard, you actually don't get as much oxygen to your cells because you're using up so much more quickly than your body can restore it. You feel a burn. So if you're competitively racing, you might fight through that burn and make some ATP, but not a lot. Or you might listen to your body that tells you to stop running, catch your breath, get more oxygen into your body, and then that burn goes away as it gets reconverted back into glucose. Alternatively, in yeast, a fungus, a prokaryotic single-celled fungus, we get, I'm going to call it ethanol fermentation. If you remember from chemistry, ethanol with an OL ending refers to an alcohol, right? So this is how alcohol is produced. And what happens when there's not oxygen present, this glucose is converted into ethanol, or the alcohol. It's a 2-carbon alcohol. ADP plus P is converted into ATP, but this 6-carbon molecule gets converted into 2 ethanols. And ethanol, I said, is a 2-carbon alcohol. 2-carbon alcohol. So we're missing 2 carbons, so it actually produces 2 CO2 molecules. Okay? So these CO2 molecules are gas, right? So they leave the environment, and so we're really left with just this 2-carbon molecule. So it cannot be reversed, right? Cannot be reversed. Like that happens in animals, right? So we lost some carbon here. But this alcohol is what's produced, and it actually happens in yeast and some plants, right? Not all plants, but some. So there's a section in the book in orange about yeast and its uses, as well as anaerobic respiration in humans, that you should probably read, that adds a little bit to this. But what I want to talk about now is this aerobic respiration. And what I'll do is put this in a different color. I'll put this in red, because I think red is an important color to think about, because it's going to denote a lot of key information. This is really where we're going to dive into a lot more detail here, okay? Not in this video, but soon enough. So if oxygen is present, that glucose can be broken down to make more ATP. And it involves a lot of different chemical reactions. So we're going to talk about things like the Krebs Cycle, which you might have heard of before, and the electron transport chain. Again, right? It's a different kind of electron transport chain, but you should know it's very similar to the one that we talked about in photosynthesis. And so when we talk, so this is really that full equation right up here, right? So that's That's what's going on here. When you have oxygen, you're going to make lots and lots of this ATP with these byproducts. And this all happens in the mitochondria. So what we're going to do is dive into this next, but not in this video. So I'm going to stop here. I'm at 25 minutes. I'm going to stop. And I hope that you have some questions, but definitely that you not just take notes, but you study this. Because I expect you to know this inside and out so that when we talk about how it's different than aerobic respiration, you do not confuse these concepts, okay?